Last week, a report from Reuters came out about a Russian overture for a ceasefire that was made in late 2023 and into January 2024. The recipient of the message was Washington, which obviously rejected the proposal. However, I think it is worth going into greater detail as to why the answer was no. There was the obvious point that this is Ukraine's war, not the United States's, which we probably all have a good understanding of. But there are a couple more subtle points that tend to get lost in the shuffle, and distorted because of the disagreement in Congress. One about exactly where the bargaining power lies among the key players, and another about how Western incentives have evolved since the war began. Let's begin with what was in the report, because usually we only get whispers of this happening, rather than actually seeing something a bit more substantiated. There is a link in the description if you want to read it yourself, but the thrust of it is as follows. Russia allegedly tried to engage with the United States on multiple fronts. The first was via third-party Arab countries. Specific countries were not named in the report, but Putin visited Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in December. Now, these talks occurred just 6 hours apart and in separate cities, so make of that what you will regarding the depth of the conversation. The second path was done through back channels in Turkey. These involved individuals who were not officially working for either government, but ostensibly still had clearance to relay messages to their respective leaders, with all of the discussions occurring in the shadows. Regardless of the location of the conversations, the basic idea was that a ceasefire would take hold at the current line of control, and freeze it for an unknown length of time. Some version of that message made it back to Washington, where Secretary of State Antony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and CIA Director William Burns met to discuss a response. And that response was blunt. The decision to reach a ceasefire was Kyiv's, not Washington's. Essentially, the Kremlin was barking up the wrong peace tree. The United States was also worried about the sincerity of the proposal. We recently discussed the incentive that Russia has to stall through the end of the year, though the incentives are all a bit confusing right now because Russia is the one that is currently taking the majority of the offensive action. The whole report cited 3 unnamed Russian sources for all of its information. Make of that what you will. They claim that Putin was serious about the ceasefire, but would prefer aggressive offensive actions if nothing was agreed to. Meanwhile, the day after the report came out, Putin dismissed it as false. Cue Washington's own skepticism about that. Okay, assuming that the report is accurate, why did Russia issue the proposal? The short answer is that this was no roll of the dice. It comes at basically no cost or risk to the Kremlin. If it fails, then basically nothing happens. I suppose you get some YouTube videos about it, but not much more. And on the off chance that it does work, the Kremlin gets what it presumably wants. More broadly, it fits into a narrative that is mostly intended for Russia's domestic audience. That Ukraine is a puppet, and that the West is the one that is pulling all of the strings. The version of this that you have most likely heard of is that there was a deal in place between Russia and Ukraine after the Battle of Kyiv concluded. But then Boris Johnson forced Ukraine to keep fighting. Must have been those darn chickens. What exactly Britain's coercive mechanism there was is unclear, and the alternative account is that the West offered to supply Ukraine weapons more broadly, and that it was up to Kyiv to decide what to do with them. There may also be some effort to portray Russia as the reasonable actor to international audiences. We have talked at length about how the war will almost certainly end in some sort of political conclusion. Ukraine will not be marching on Moscow, and the likelihood that Russia gets a second shot at Kyiv is very unlikely. Now, despite the Kremlin wanting to promote the narrative that it is the one seeking peace, I would bet against these two sitting down at a table again and having a pleasant conversation. War does not always come to a formal end in a grand ballroom. The point is, Neither military is going to be able to impose the terms of the settlement on the other. Rather, the war will continue until one side opts to quit given a particular division. Along those lines, the game being played right now is whether that is going to be closer to Kyiv, closer to Crimea, or something along the current line of control. Some suggestive evidence that the proposal was not serious, but rather meant for the media cycle, is how it seems to misunderstand how bargaining power works in the conflict. The first of these misunderstandings is where the weak link is. Look, it is very easy to see the dysfunction going on in Congress, and conclude that the United States is eager for the war to end, no matter the terms of the settlement. Certainly, that would describe a handful of House Republicans. The thing is, though, that this is not where the majority of the hang-up is. Zooming out, one of the ways you get wars to end is by reaching a mutually hurting stalemate. Nothing is going on the front lines, and no one is learning anything about the strength or willingness of the parties to fight. But the costs being paid on a daily basis start to rack up. Something has to give. When both parties find themselves in that position, you want to be the one suffering less, so that you still have the upper hand in negotiations. That is part of the reason why Ukraine has started attacking Russia's oil infrastructure. There was another attack last Thursday, by the way. Now, who is suffering more at the moment is an important question that is still part of the ongoing debate. But one thing I can tell you for sure is that among the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, the United States is suffering the least. No Americans are dying. No American infrastructure is being destroyed. And much of the aid dollars offered to Ukraine are just subsidies to the US military, with extra steps. Meanwhile, the military of one of the United States' two main rivals is getting decimated on a daily basis. The Pentagon's estimates are now 60,000 dead, and another 180 to 240,000 injured. Now, there is a general sense of instability that the war creates, and that Washington does not like. But the point is that those costs are a drop in the bucket by comparison. And most of the debate in Congress is whether paying greater costs yields an even greater pain to Russia, or if it generates a bad return on investment. Tabulating these continued costs that everyone suffers is important, because bargaining power is inversely proportional to them. So even if somehow the United States did have veto power, and could unilaterally end a war that it is not actually fighting, that is not where the vulnerability lies. The United States could maintain the status quo indefinitely, and barely notice. The fact that the war ranks 12th in top voter priorities tells you something about that. Again, where Russia and Ukraine rank relative to one another is subject to debate, and Ukraine's withdrawal from Avdiivka is informative. But the key point here is that the United States is not the one suffering. The other odd part about the proposal is how the terms, from the perspective of the West, look much worse now than they would have 2 years ago. And I am not just talking about where the line of control is, because that again is something that Ukraine internalizes much more than any Western country could. And if you do not believe me, Avdiivka is being 6x'd by Taylor Swift in this week's news. To be fair to the media, I did write this slide before Russia captured the city. In any case, the change in perspective from 2 years ago that I am referring to is where those aforementioned nebulous geopolitical instability costs come from. Much of this is in the form of messy international trade and running global supply chains, both for love letters and things with a little more economic heft. When a war lasts a couple of weeks, no one is going to massively rethink their procurement plans. But when a war goes on for 2 years, you go well beyond the rethinking stage. The new systems have already been implemented. Now, when this war ends, there will be some amount of Western reinvestment in Russia. But do not expect to see much fanfare there. No appearances by former secretaries of state. The Kremlin has burned enough bridges that many businesses are going to avoid investing in Russia, purely due to the social stigma concerns. Moreover, much of the pre-existing business infrastructure is gone, has been acquired by domestic companies, or has been superseded. For example, Germany has installed the previously alluded to liquid natural gas terminals, pushing piped-in Russian gas to the back seat. So when you view the West's opportunity cost for war in 2022, you get a larger amount back then than you do today. And lower costs mean greater bargaining power. Even within the Western coalition, Russia seems to be choosing the wrong target here. One place that I can tell you that costs have not gotten larger are for my books on the Russia-Ukraine war. That's right, I'm doing my part in helping fight inflation. Check the video description for more information on them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. Hey, you made it all the way to the end. Don't forget, I heart you.